Hello everybody and welcome back to the backyard again. It's supposed to rain a little bit later today, so at least you have the guarantee that I'll be done quickly. So if you haven't seen it, this video is sort of a follow-up to a video I put up a couple days ago. If you didn't watch that video, I highly recommend you do, because a lot of the ideas I'm going to be going into today kind of tie into the foundation I set for this theory in the first video. So if you haven't watched it, try to watch it now. But for the uninitiated, I basically put forward that the Elden Ring DLC taking place in the Shadow of the Erd Tree will be, in actuality, inside of Miquella's dream world. I basically got this idea from, if you just look at the trailer, the locations kind of look very dreamlike, very exaggerated, almost like an impressionistic view of the lands between drawn from the mind of a child, kind of like Alice in Wonderland. And that would make sense for the character of Miquella, who is eternally stuck as a child. In the comments section of the other video, someone put forward an idea that basically the IGN interview with Miyazaki kind of lays out pretty concretely what the DLC is going to be about, and that it disproves the theory. I will say, full disclosure, I had not read that article. I skimmed it at the time of recording the last video, but I hadn't really gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, which I'm going to do today, because I seriously think that not only does that article not disprove this theory, it actually convinced me that I might be onto something here, and that I'm a little more right than I had imagined. But while we will be going over that article pretty early on into this video, I think it is important to say that the second half of this video is going to be a general examination of Elden Ring through the lens of it being a George R.R. Martin story. I want to go over the types of stories that George R.R. Martin writes, how much specifically that I think with the advent of this article we know that he has written for Elden Ring, and I want to try and use that knowledge to help us decipher basically what this DLC is going to be about. I will warn you at the beginning here, though, I'm not sure how aware the average Elden Ring enjoyer is at the sheer level of mania on display in the Song of Ice and Fire fandom at this point in time. It's those guys have been starved for content for years, including me. So we're about to go into some straight up schizo post theory crafting, if you'll allow me to use that terminology. I mean, geez, these guys have been mainlining copium for years. They're basically just firing off theories in all directions like they're skeet shooting. Just to really drive the point home, AltSwiftX and Glidus have been reviewing every description of food in Game of Thrones up to and including cannibalism. Glidus has previously said on one of the live streams that when The Winds of Winter comes out, he will eat it, the full 1,000 plus page novel. He's going to consume it, and I'm assuming some kind of soupy pulp. Anyway, Roose Bolton's a vampire. It doesn't matter. Back to Elden Ring. So we're not going to be going over the full article. There were a couple questions in there that were just kind of general industry questions and not really pertaining to the plot or story of Elden Ring or talking about outright gameplay mechanics. That's not what we're talking about. We're strictly going over the questions from that article that relate to the story of the DLC in relation to the rest of Elden Ring. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, the first question. Can you set the stage for us with Shadow of the Erd Tree? Where is it taking place? And can you speak kind of generally regarding what the story is going to be about? And then Miyazaki's response. First of all, the setting of the Shadow of the Erd Tree is a brand new land. It's a brand new map separate from the lands between. It is a land that has been overshadowed by the particular Shadow of the Erd Tree as opposed to the Erd Tree in the lands between. If any of this sounds kind of weird, this is because I presume it was translated from Japanese to English. This has been a problem in the Souls community for quite some time now, where the English translation will misconstrue some points of lore. If anything seems a little strange, or I have to read into any specific one of these statements a little more than it seems like I should be, that's because I'm trying to get to the root of the meaning of what Miyazaki's saying in this interview. It takes place, again, on an entirely separate, physically separate map, so it will involve a warp of sorts to get there. In terms of setting and themes, it technically occupies the same space as the lands between in the same universe. But due to something story-related we won't reveal today, this has become physically disconnected, and you'll travel to the Shadow of the Erd Tree land as a separate place. So this Land of Shadow itself is a place the player will visit to walk in the steps of Miquella. Miquella is a key part of the story this time, perhaps as guessed by many players who saw the art that was released previously. That is in fact Miquella, and it is he who has traveled to the Land of Shadow, and it's the players who will be tracing this path, following in his footsteps, trying to see what he's going to do there. Another axis of the story is Queen Marika and what she did in the Land of Shadow and what led Miquella to follow her there. So what we can glean from that statement is basically that the shadow of the Erd Tree is this other dimension, other plane of existence that is sort of overlaid on top of the lands between. And that Miquella is traveling there, and we will specifically be following him in order to learn more about the plot. That's pretty vague. That's them holding their cards pretty close to your chest, which I guess you would probably want to do if you're trying to get people to buy something, and you're not just trying to hand them the story. I understand that. But what he doesn't say is specifically what this place is. He really doesn't imply anything other than it's got some kind of vague connection to Miquella. Then the next question. So you mentioned Miquella earlier. That's a character that I know fans have a lot of questions about. Is there anything specifically that you can tell us about his role this character will play in the DLC? And I know the trailer opens with a shot of Mohg's boss arena with a hand hanging out of the cocoon. Will we learn about what Mohg did to him? Yes, the cocoon and the arm you saw at the beginning of the trailer, this is actually the point of entry to the Land of Shadow, where the players will enter to the DLC area. And this does have some relation to Miquella, and Miquella has, as we said, traveled to the Land of Shadow. He does have some motive and some objective there, which we don't want to give away too much, but essentially the player will be following in those footsteps in the same way that they followed the blessings from the grace, the sites of grace and the lands between. They'll be following in his footsteps, and this will guide them to the Land of Shadow and reveal that motivation to them. And then he goes on to say that there are a bunch of NPCs that you're going to counter, which is, I think is just, yeah. So again, what information exactly can we glean from this description? Yeah, of course, we're going to be entering this place through Miquella's cocoon. Specifically, he mentions the cocoon in the article. And he specifically states it does have some relationship with Miquella. We don't know it yet. The Land of Shadow is intrinsically tied to him somehow. Again, we're being very vague here. This feels like it's almost a mystery. Why has Miquella gone there? I mean, that's pretty evident from the trailer too. But I think FromSoft is telling us explicitly here, or Miyazaki is telling us explicitly here, this is a mystery. You're going to have to unravel it as you travel through this place. Then the next question. There were a lot of striking bosses and enemies that were revealed in this trailer, and I was wondering if we could go through a handful of them one by one, and you can either explain who or what they are, tell us an anecdote about their design, or anything you want. I'm going to do my best to describe them because I don't know the names of them. First off, there's like a giant basket of flaming kindling, and that's that giant flame monster who I said was probably an impressionistic view of a fire giant. And Miyazaki's response, so this giant basket of flame, as you so eloquently put it, was a terrible weapon that you used in a war that occurred in the Land of Shadow, basically. So again, without saying too much, we can't give away the name just officially, but yes, it is a really gruesome weapon that was used. And the kindling you see is actually the remains of bodies that were put in there to burn. So there's a friendly fellow. Again, specifically, Miyazaki kind of dodges that question. He just says, yep, that is what it looks like. It is a giant cage shaped like a guy full of corpses. It's that one panel of Berserk. He just says that there was a war fought there, and if this is, in my theory, Miquella's dream, this is a, again, representation of the War of the Giants in ages past. Then the guy tries to ask about the dickworm enemies, but Miyazaki just kind of cuts him off and says, it's hard to talk about some of these enemies without spoiling anything. Hopefully you understand, but there is a significant connection between these enemies, the way that they are, and the Land of Shadow. Even if this isn't Miquella's dreamscape, Miyazaki is implicitly implying that these enemies, their nature, the way that they look and behave, is tied to the laws or magic surrounding the Land of Shadow. The way that they are and how outlandish they look is explicitly stated to be tied to this realm. Switching gears for a second, one of the big news points, I think, of Elden Ring was that the scenario was written by George R.R. Martin. Did he have any kind of role in the planning of the Shadow of the Erd Tree? And if so, just out of curiosity, have you talked to him since the game has come out? And has there been any kind of reaction to the outstanding success of the game? And then Miyazaki responds, the way George Martin's story has been incorporated is the same as it was with the base game in Elden Ring. And to avoid misunderstanding there, we just want to point out that he has not written anything exclusively and new for the sake of this DLC. But it still would be fair to say that he and his mythos that he created for us are involved in the creation of Shadow of the Erd Tree in the same way. And the reason for that is that in the making of the base game, in the making of Elden Ring, we took from that mythos, but we only took one part of it. We took from a part that created the story of Elden Ring and created the world that we wanted to envision. And the Shadow of the Erd Tree is yet another part of the original mythos that he wrote and that inspired us to create the story of this DLC. He goes on to talk about him and George R.R. Martin exchanging emails, which is kind of cute and touching. But this, I feel like, gives us a lot more clarity on the level of contribution that George gave to this project. I mean, we knew from day one that he wrote the mythos, but now we know that there is a lot more at play here that we don't really know about. All of these characters just opened up to being some kind of fully fledged person with a backstory and a motive. It's like if you zoomed in on A Song of Ice and Fire and you really only focused on a couple characters and can only really glean what was going on in other parts of the world based on that magnified view that you had of it. Essentially, what this question is saying that there is a wealth of information about Miquella that was not present in the base game that we're going to be getting here. And then the final question, this one isn't so relevant, but on the topic of the Shadow of the Erdtree, do you envision this as the end of Elden Ring's story, or is there room for either more DLC or an Elden Ring 2 down the line? Miyazaki says, we don't want to say this is the end of Elden Ring saga for now. I think we said a similar thing at the end of Dark Souls 3. We didn't want to flatten those possibilities or put a pin in them at that time, and it's a similar story with Elden Ring. We don't want to discourage the possibilities for that. There might be some more ideas in the future. We don't have any plans to make a second DLC or sequel, but we definitely don't want to snuff out that possibility. So, what do we learn here? I think given the vague nature of Miyazaki's contributions to what the DLC is going to be about in the article, and him explicitly stating that this is still part of George R.R. Martin's original mythos, I believe it's fair to dive into this topic of viewing Elden Ring specifically as a George R.R. Martin joint. And this is sort of an angle that I see underrepresented in the way that people talk about the story in Elden Ring. Again, I don't know how much overlap there is between people who like A Song of Ice and Fire and people who play Elden Ring. I'd imagine there's probably a large portion of the community that likes both. But I see vastly underrepresented in lore channels that I like to watch. And this is not to their discredit. They're doing a really excellent job of having some of the fun that the Song of Ice and Fire community has been having for years revolving around George's works. But I don't really see people delving into A Song of Ice and Fire as a reference point for the type of characters that George creates and how that might have influenced his work on Elden Ring. So if we approach it from that angle, and the thesis statement of this DLC is who is Miquella and what is he doing, I think if we view it through that lens, it'll illuminate some things that have sort of been hidden from us. To use another Game of Thrones term, this is essentially when the sample chapters for Winds of Winter were leaked. We're information starved, and we want more. We want more George. So I think it's time to get us some. And just to really drive home the fact that this is a George R.R. Martin story, I'm going to directly reference some ideas that come up a lot in A Song of Ice and Fire and say how I also see them represented in Elden Ring. So I guess I have to preface this by saying pretty, minor to moderate spoilers for A Song of Ice and Fire if you haven't read it. A couple classic anecdotes about the way that George writes these types of stories. He essentially writes the same story like 10 times. He'll repeat certain story beats or motives throughout the entirety of the work. And say what you want about that, but I think it does a good job of really driving home the moral lesson or theme that George is trying to present. And another direct quote from George, he writes about the heart in conflict with itself. So I just to dive into the meaning of that, obviously that is just talking about stories that are interesting if they are emotional and about characters who are at a crossroads who have to make hard decisions, right? You see that a lot of times in A Song of Ice and Fire. Characters who have to make decisions that are at odds with their principles and values. To use one specific example, a big theme in Game of Thrones is that feudalism as a system of governance is bad. George's sort of moral point there is that a system of governance that does awful things and commits atrocities and lowers the average quality of life of its citizen based on solely the whims and personal desires of a small group of people like a family or a ruling class, that is pretty bad, pretty all-around bad, right? And you see this theme portrayed in parts of Game of Thrones like the Starks. The Starks are altruistic, good people. They're a tight-knit family unit. But you could say that their feud with the Lannisters is at the core of why the War of the Five Kings started. And if that feud didn't exist, if this was a total neutral form of government, some kind of collective thing because George is like a 70s hippie, it wouldn't have happened. So, individuals interfering with the well-understood laws of the land, circumventing them, that is bad and shouldn't happen. And if you think about it, that is a direct foil to the Gold Mask questline in Elden Ring. Gold Mask has this entire questline, if you don't know, where he's trying to intuit why the Golden Order failed and how to fix it. And at the end of the day, after various plot events and what have you takes place over the length of the quest, he eventually comes down to the fact, after you tell him that Radagon is America, that God's... you know what? I'm going to find the actual quote, the direct quote, because it's so perfect. It's so succinctly George. So, to quote directly from the wiki, at the end of the Gold Mask questline, you receive the Mending Rune of Order, which is Gold Mask's sort of magnum opus, his end-all, be-all plan to repair the Elden Ring and fix the laws of reality. So, straight from the wiki, a rune of transcendental ideology, which will attempt to perfect the Golden Order. Current imperfection of the Golden Order, or the instability of the ideology, can be blamed upon the fickleness of gods no better than men. That is the fly in the ointment. If you really read into what's being said there, it's essentially that the shattering occurred because the form of governance or the laws that govern reality and nature, the Elden Ring, were meddled with. No matter how altruistic Marika's goals might have been, her goals at some point fundamentally diverged from what was good for the common person and resulted in the downfall of the Lands Between, the shattering. That is the exact same moral lesson that George has been trying to impart to us in A Song of Ice and Fire. So, I hope I made that clear. But just to rapid fire off some other connections, we've had a red-haired woman who has a nebulous connection to some sinister, dark god. We've had a scheming, plotting person who is intensely at odds with the order of the world around them and will do some morally gray and some not so morally gray things to achieve those goals. I think an archetypical character that we are missing from this George story is a young person who has some kind of magical psychic awakenings, a young person who has a magic puberty of sorts. You see this with characters like Jon Snow, you see it with characters like Daenerys Targaryen, and chiefly in this analogy, you see it with Brandon Stark. And again, for those of you who don't know about A Song of Ice and Fire, at the very beginning of the first book, one of the Stark children is pushed from a window and breaks both of his legs and becomes a cripple, disabled. But after the advent of this, he enters a comatose state where he's not conscious, but in these dreams he has while he's in this state, Bran starts to communicate with this otherworldly entity, a figure known as the Three-Eyed Crow, who begins to try to convince Bran to fly. And in these dreams, he has prophetic visions of the future that he can't understand yet because he doesn't have the right information. He sees the bodies of all the other dead dreamers like him who are trying to achieve this magical awakening in themselves. There's even a theme of when he was young, Bran always imagined that he would grow up to become a knight, a noble, chivalrous knight, and then at the advent of these magical powers, he gets excited at the prospect of becoming a wizard, but then over time, as he interacts with these magical powers of his, he realizes that they might be more sinister than he originally envisioned, and he's going down this dark path, and he loses this sort of childhood innocence that he has at the beginning of the story. Now, if we're looking for dramatic foils from A Song of Ice and Fire to Elden Ring, Miquella is that character. He's eternally young. He has this youthful energy about him that a lot of item descriptions and characters talk about. And this place, this Shadow of the Erd Tree, is full of a lot of dark ideas. Things like Deathblight and the Crucible. It's all ideas that if Miquella had heard about growing up in Leyndell, in the capital, around all these people, he would have a lot of time to ruminate and think about those things. And really, if this DLC is supposed to get us thinking about what are the goals and motivations of Miquella, I think we can look at what he was doing directly before the state he gets to now as some kind of guiding hand. We should look at what he was doing before he was ripped from his cocoon. Now, in order to talk about this, I believe we need to talk about who Miquella is, specifically his status as an Empyrean. We look at other Empyreans in this same era, so people like Melania and Ronnie, people who have done these great magical feats. We need to determine what Empyreans are capable of in actuality in the world of the Lands Between. For instance, Malenia is an Empyrean. She's somebody that the Greater Will has pointed at and said, you are a suitable replacement for Marika as the god of our Golden Order. And then you look at the feats that Malenia is capable of, whether she wants to be or not, but every time she's bloomed, it's resulted in this massive spread of scarlet rot. The entirety of Caelid is subsumed. Another demigod is driven mad by their conflict and his infection with the scarlet rot. Even though Radahn specifically has a fiery rune that is said to be the reason that he was able to stave it off, it still destroyed his mind. There's this massive ancient civilization at the Lake of Rot beneath Liurnia, which is worshipping the coming of this new god, this new entity. So I guess what I'm really trying to drive home here is that Empyreans in Elden Ring are capable of some truly insane shit. So that begs the question, what would Miquella be capable of as the god Saint Trina of a domain of dreams and of abundance? Well, he could create this entire realm, this entire place. And I don't like relying on cut content too much, because in previous Dark Souls games that it seems that From took that stuff out for a reason. But in this instance, when we know that all of this story and content was relating to George R.R. Martin's story, and that there is a sort of Bible there that to fall back on, a foundation, I feel comfortable talking about this content from a character called Rico, who was an adherent of Saint Trina or Miquella and was essentially following in his footsteps until he was cut from the original game. I'm going to read some dialogue directly from Rico. Finally, I have found it. Saint Trina's, no, Lord Miquella's cadaver. I have partaken of untold secrets, such that I may aid you, O Lord. So please, I hope you welcome your humble servant Rico into your dream, the world of your heart. Indeed, I beg of you to grant my wish that when you transcend from Empyrean to God, allow me a place by your side. So, again, this could be referring to Miquella's dream of the sort of new world that he wants to create, where Albinurix and Misbegotten, all these people that the Golden Order has cast out or said are distasteful. He wants a world where they are allowed to thrive and have fulfilling lives. That was an objective of his before the Shattering, or after the Shattering. So if that was his objective, and then immediately following that, he enters this long comatose-like sleep rebirth inside this cocoon, leaving Malenia to guard his spot in the Halig tree. Is that not what he was trying to accomplish by having that occur? And if you read it like this, then I believe Miquella represents a long-standing tradition in Dark Souls games, FromSoft games, where there is a character who has a dream or an ideal land that is full of shunned people, a painting. Miquella's dream is a painting from Dark Souls 2 or from Dark Souls 1 or 3. A place where the unwanted people of the world can go to escape and can have their own little corner and nobody bothers them there. Miquella's dream is a painted world. And again, just to really drive it home, if we view this as a George R.R. Martin story, let's look at other characters' plots and how they sort of develop throughout the games, right? So talking about Ranni, you have the Knight of the Black Knives, you have her killing her own two fingers, you have the entire questline that's in the base game. We viewed a portion of that story. If this were a full George R.R. Martin story, we'd be there from the beginning and we'd have very clear view of her motives and what she was trying to accomplish. But because it's a FromSoft game, we came in at the very end and we got like the last couple chapters. We didn't really see the whole plot, right? And if that's what this is the part of Miquella's story that we're getting. The part of Miquella's story that is the end, right? Of the larger George R.R. Martin plot, this is the end of Miquella's tale. And if you think about it, if this is a giant character investigation into who Miquella is, that's very George. So, let's summarize. From the IGN interview, we can see that Miyazaki was very, very cagey and basically says that, hey, you're going to have to figure out what's going on here for yourself, figure out the mystery. We used another part of George's world. So we can use that to investigate the kinds of works that George writes, and we can infer intertextually what kind of stories he writes and how that might influence this DLC, which I think is a fair thing to say. What we learned from the IGN article is that it doesn't necessarily rule out my theory, and I specifically think that the things that Miyazaki has omitted are the things that would reveal the twist. If you go back and look at the original Elden Ring trailer, they literally show you who broke the Elden Ring and who is trying to repair it. They show Radagon Marika. There's the shot of despair of Radagon, the hair turning red, and Radagon lamenting its destruction, and there are shots of feminine Marika destroying it. And that was in the launch trailer, the announcement. So I think they're playing the same trick again. I think this is FromSoft showing us in our face what's exactly happening in the DLC, but giving us none of the context that we need to understand it. And when viewed as a George R.R. Martin joint, we can infer that this is indeed what's going on, and I think by looking at certain characters from A Song of Ice and Fire, you can kind of infer what's happening here. I hope this ramble made some sense, because I wrote it in a day, like the last video. I probably jumped the gun a little bit too early on the first video, to be honest, because I should have let these ideas linger. This I feel is a little bit more concrete. But basically that's it. I'm intensely excited. If this doesn't happen, by the way, that's fine too. I'm just having a little bit of fun over here, coming up with my copium theory. But this is super cool. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. We're almost up to 500 subscribers now, which is, god damn, that is fucking monumental. It is so cool to me that people will just listen to me talk for, about 30 minutes a piece, and they like it. You guys like this? But yeah, I think it is starting to rain now, and my phone is my camera. So I'm going to go back inside and edit this up and try to get out quickly. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.